All right, well, if you can't hear any of us, do let us know. I'm Robert Manne, and on my far left is Jeff Sparrow, and we're going to be talking this evening with Alexa O'Brien. I'll say a few things. In the age of Google, I think introductions are usually not necessary. So I want to say something not so much the kind of thing you can read if you Google Alexa O'Brien, but my impressions. I've been incredibly inspirited in recent years by a number of what for me are young people who have decided in conscience to give their lives to trying to make the world a better place. And a few years ago I began to concentrate on what Julian Assange was doing, and without really understanding it for a while I then came to see how significant a figure he is. And I think Australians should be rather proud to have produced someone as both moral and effectual politically as he has been. And we'll talk about that. Two others who have emerged we'll be talking about. One is Bradley, now Chelsea Manning. The other is Edward Snowden. And there are many others in the United States. Now, one of the people I think of like this, whose work I only really got to know a few months ago, is Alexa O'Brien, who I feel very privileged to be able to talk with. Alexa was very involved, as I understand it, with Occupy Wall Street, although, and for the reasons we'll try and find out, she doesn't like talking about it that much. I'll try and find out why. But she then, and she was very involved in, as an independent journalist reporting the Arab Spring, and again I'd like to talk a bit about the experiences of that. Because of her work, she's brushed up against the American state in a very serious way with accusations, which I take it didn't come to anything in the end, that she was somehow connected to terrorism. But she's felt the real fear that would come from the American state deciding to threaten. I think the work for which at the moment she'll be best remembered and most honoured is the work she's done with the trial of, we'll now call Chelsea Manning, sitting, I read somewhere, 14 hours a day minimum, working day after day, recording what was going on in the trial. And I'd like actually to find out a little bit more about that when mainstream journalism was just not doing the job. I didn't know until recently that Alexa had spent time living in Australia in the past. She's incredibly welcome back. She is, I think, one of the heroes of the age and should be better known in this country, and I hope will be as a result. I can just say we did an extraordinary event at the Sydney Opera House a few days ago, and I would recommend that you all have a look at that, which I think was I think it could be said of some historical importance, where Alexa was on stage, but Julian Assange, Glenn Greenwald, who's been an incredibly significant journalist, particularly, he was the one that Edward Snowden went to and could trust, and has been doing an intellectually astonishing job in recording the meaning of the documents that Edward Snowden brought with him. We'll talk about that, Alexa, if we could later. And also David Coombs, the wonderful attorney, military attorney who's been defending Chelsea Manning, was also on Skype, and it was an hour and a half of incredible discussion, and I do recommend everyone here to it's on YouTube, and I recommend you take a look at it. It will, I think, in the future be seen as an absolutely central discussion of the issues which go to the heart of the problem of contemporary life, I think. So, Alexa, Jeff and I are going to ask questions, and have a discussion on all of these issues. Jeff and I have worked out. Jeff, for those who I'm sure everyone does know, is the editor of Overland and a leading writer, and a member of Victoria University. So Jeff, would you like to start? Jeff and I worked out a rough order of proceedings by email today. So.
Sure. It seems like we are sharing this funny piddling little microphone. Do we actually need a microphone? Yes, we do. Okay. Okay, well, I guess the obvious question to ask, and I'm sure you've been asked this 100 times before, but just to get us in the frame, reporting on what takes place, an incredibly complicated legal proceeding like that would be a remarkable challenge, even for a very experienced journalist with all the resources of a big media corporation behind them. You didn't have those resources behind you. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what kind of a learning curve you had to go through, what the challenges were, and what you had to learn along the way to do that work. Here's the microphone.
Well, it's a military proceeding, so there's a manual for court-martial, which is probably 6,000 to 10,000 pages long. And the trial was a court-martial, so you had a lot of military lingo. I mean, even things like 2BCT, 2nd Brigade Combat Team, having to understand the structure of military chain of command, these kinds of things. So the learning curve was certainly significant, but it wasn't insurmountable. By the time I got to the pre-trial, I pretty much understood sort of basic chain of command issues that I needed, and there was a refrain of certain rules for court-martial that kept reoccurring. So, I would just reference back to those, legal documents, and I would say that by the middle of the pre-trial, the proceeding was 20 months long, I pretty much had nailed the U.S. government's case down. And it was gratifying when the trial came, because, when you're trying to cover a secret trial and you're the only source of information and people are relying on you for accuracy and you don't have a legal background and there aren't any lawyers there and there aren't any press there, it is a bit terrifying because, you don't want to make any mistakes. And I was very happy to know that a year before the trial, I pretty much had already figured out what the investigative and the legal theories were for the prosecution. So that was reassuring to me. I mean, it was a lot of work. I didn't have a personal life. I worked every day. I worked all day long. It was doable.
Can I ask a slightly more general question now? First one, why you decided to do this, give your life to it, what you think the significance of the trial is.
The prosecution of then Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, was the largest leak trial in U.S. history. It was a historic trial, and it is part of an even larger criminal investigation, the largest criminal investigation ever conducted into a publisher and its source. It is a map of the entire interagency process being honed in on one organization and a sources. And I felt that I was, sure that the press wasn't going to cover it adequately because I'd seen in the year prior to her court-martial, specifically her treatment at Quantico, the dribs and drabs of information coming out, and I thought, God, even when I was a child during the Iran-Contra affair, we knew who the actors were and we knew what the institutions were. I mean, we might not have known everything that was going on, but there was some sense of some investigative journalist at the Washington Post or someone at the New York Times who kind of had a handle on what was going on, and there was nothing there. And it seemed like, simply cheerleading for then Bradley Manning wasn't going to do it. And I wanted to know what was going on here. Who were the people at the State Department? Who was in charge of the criminal investigation at the Department of Justice? What was their institutional interests? what were the agents' names? Who were the potential witnesses? So I decided that I was going to just get as much information out. And that's why I started with the transcripts and the timeline. The timeline was for me also an education, because, you know, I really had to sort of figure out which agencies and which institutions, and going through and making an accounting of the public record and building the timeline was, I decided that I wasn't going to hoard that information to myself. I would publish it on my website. That means that, you know, another journalist doesn't have to do the investigative work. I've already done it. They can scale off of it. And much like, you know, a lot of us, I had a hope that if I did all the investigative work or laid the groundwork, then another journalist who might be more experienced or might, you know, have an audience already established that had little resources, they didn't have the investigative budget that you had in the 80s or the 70s, that they could actually use my work to good effect, and that we could sort of, in a sort of team effort, expose what was going on or educate the public. You know, that didn't happen.
It's there.
It's there. I certainly had journalists come to me, but it was interesting to actually see how they expected to be spoon-fed by me as well. You know, much like they expect to be spoon-fed by the military. I had one journalist who did a profile on Manning who was adamant about, you know, they said, well, I need this information. I said, well, I gave them a bunch of links. This is for this, this is for this, this is for this. And they were like, well, I can't find it on your website. And they would complain to me how my website didn't have like good UI, user interface, and I thought, I'm like working 18 hours a day just to get, you know, like do some work, you know.
Just one other question.
Yep.
You've written, I think, very movingly about Chelsea Manning, and it's a strange thing. You saw the court for 20 months, and yet you've never once spoken to her face to face. You can't. But could you just say a little bit about your impression of the kind of character that decided, for whatever reason, to pass to WikiLeaks this astonishing amount of material on American behaviour in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the State Department? What is she like?
I was, during deliberations, there was no one in the courtroom except for the judge, one member of the defense team, one member of the government prosecutors, and the military prosecutors, and Manning. And there was no press around at that point.
Because they weren't interested.
They weren't interested, or it was their time off. So I wanted to be in the courtroom. I was actually quite disappointed that there wasn't any public there either during this sort of, I think, probably the most nerve-wracking time for an accused. But I will say this, there were people who did show up, and it was quite moving. There was a man named Jim who showed up in a wheelchair from San Diego to be in the courtroom for 5 seconds, you know, as the judge opened the court and then went into deliberations. So there were moments like that were very moving in this period of deliberation for the verdict. And I remember I came into court, and normally, you know, if you're a member of the press and you have press credentials at Fort Meade, you're essentially a cage in an animal. You're an animal in a cage. You can't go anywhere without an escort. Sometimes it's almost better if you go as public because you can actually walk around the base. So I walked into the courtroom, and normally they tell you where to sit if you're a member of the press, and there was no one there. So defense turned around and turned to the legal administrator and said, you know, Miss O'Brien, you sit in the front row, there's no one here. And Manning looked over at defense counsel and said, I'm a member of the defense team. I help write briefs. And it was probably the only moment that I actually got to see Manning interact with her defense counsel. And what I saw was a young person. It really hit me how young Manning was. And when you saw Manning on the stand, especially when he first spoke at the part of the motion hearing, which was back in November 2012, December 2012, around her unlawful pretrial confinement at Quantico, There are 9 hours of testimony. I mean, many people freaked out when Manning made the statement for the pleading to 10 lesser included offenses back in February. But Manning actually had 9 hours of testimony, which is on my website. And the character that was on the stand was so endearing. In fact, the entire press pool was quite charmed by Manning. Even the lead military prosecutor, Major Ashton Fine, who was quite bombastic and proud and strident, in the way in which the rhetoric in the courtroom was taken aback at how deferential Manning was to authority. I'll give you an example. The issue of Manning's current chain of command came up, and her current chain of command visits her in prison. That's part of the responsibility of her current chain of command. And there were issues around accounting for whether or not Manning was being treated well at Quantico, and there's a questionnaire that the prosecution had given to her chain of command to say, are you being treated well? Check. Are you doing this? Check, check, check. And Manning talked about how much respect he had for his current chain of command, and how nice they were to him how nice they were to her to bring her, sneakers, and how much she looked up to them. And she was so respectful, and I questioned whether or not being a detainee for so long had actually sort of rubbed off on her, where there is a sort of detainee prison guard relationship. I mean, she's in a military prison, so every day she's interacting in that way. But I think that that's actually also part of who Manning is. There wasn't an ounce of mendacity to this young person. And when you see someone, day in and day out, whether they're sitting next to their attorney or they're on the stand, you can kind of get a sense for a person. The other thing too is Manning is very scientific and methodical and very earnest. So if asked a question, will answer in an incredibly earnest way, almost that it seems a bit at first naive, but over a period of hours, as you listen, you realize there's a sort of old-fashioned common sense to it. Almost Midwestern, almost like Oklahoma sort of earnestness. I don't know if this really will be a helpful metaphor, but it sort of reminds me when my grandmother talks. She has a particular vernacular that she uses. She doesn't really sound, everyone who was born in the 80s or 90s, they sound like an advertising salesman to some degree. Manning doesn't have that. I don't know, do you know what I'm talking about? If you hear Cary Grant, even in an old interview, there is a certain kind of genteelness to them. That's the sort of way in which Manning speaks, and very methodical and logical. So, for example, Manning asked defense counsel, David Coombs, not to speak to the press at all during this entire proceeding, only to use text-based factual documents posted on a website, which shows you also the commitment that's there. So to sort of sum up this whole kind of picture of Manning from these little tidbits, there's a commitment there. And Manning is a very strong and indomitable character in the courtroom because of the earnestness. So despite the rhetoric, despite the clearly unfair trial, despite everything stacked against her, she was neutral and a litmus test for everything going on around her.
It's fascinating. Jeff?
Well, that flows into something that I'm very keen to ask you about. One of the quotes that Julian Assange is best known for is the notion that courage is courageous and
contagious.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense, does it? And from what we know of Manning's motivation, it seems to be very central as well, this sense that having access to very important information, you have a moral responsibility to take a stand. At the same time, it seems like the US state also accepts that logic, except from a reverse perspective, that is here clearly trying to set an example. If you leak this information, you will be crushed, you will be kept in torturous conditions, you'll be hit with a terribly unfair trial, you'll face decades in prison. I was wondering your assessment of how that is playing out with this, where the trial is at now. what has been the sort of takeaway for other whistleblowers? Are we in a situation now where the legacy of the case now is that people are more likely to speak out, or has the state been effective in setting a sort of terrible warning of what will happen if you go down that path?
Well, to answer, it will be a bit of speculation because I haven't interviewed, hundreds of whistleblowers to sort of get a sense. I would say that in some cases it will scare people. En masse, probably it will scare a lot of people, and it will also scare journalists because of the possibility of getting caught. Maybe people will be far more picky about who they would go to also with information and how they would get in contact with that person, and making sure that they don't have a digital trail, which all adds cost and energy to that process. I think people also are less likely to trust the institutions like the New York Times. I mean, there's a reason why Snowden didn't go to the New York Times, I would imagine. Here we have, why did Snowden go to The Guardian?
It's the only paper in the world worth reading. In the English.
I think that I think it's a big deal that, the Times reporters I saw at the Manning trial, who were the national security reporters, were sort of in the dark a bit about that. And I think that's that the New York Times should look at that if they are concerned about their future market. But anyway, I think it will embolden other people. It's sort of like in any kind of social dynamic. If you have somebody who is pounding around and showing all their kinetic energy, there's no mystery to what will happen to you. Someone is bound to stand up. It might not be en masse, but
Well, can I say something about that? I mean, I was very taken by it. It was actually, I think, Billy Graham, strangely enough, the evangelist, who created this phrase, "Courage is contagious," and it was then became Julian Assange's, as Jeff said, one of his favourite kind of sayings. But I think what's interesting is that, and this connects to WikiLeaks, is that it doesn't mean that most people will become courageous, seeing that there are some courageous people in the world. What it does mean is that there are a few. And I think Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning is obviously one who knew about WikiLeaks. And I was incredibly impressed, maybe you could say something about this. Actually, I got to know about you really because of this, that I wanted to read the statement to court. And suddenly I realised why she had done what she'd done. A very eloquent, detailed account, which, because of Alexa, is in the public world. But anyhow, the things she saw in Iraq were such that she thought she had no alternative but to act. And again, that seriousness and earnestness you talk about, moral straightness, the Cary Grant sort of way of looking at the world, you could see in the statement, it was a very, very serious thing. Similarly, we don't know much about Edward Snowden, but this one fellow seeing what turns out to be this incredible business that the American state is basically snooping on the entire population, not only of America but the world, thought, I can't do nothing with this. Conscience is. So I think for most people courage isn't contagious, but there are some people coming out of nowhere for no good reason for whom it is. And so I think in a way, a lot of people I think left WikiLeaks when they became frightened. But some didn't. The people that now surround Assange are the people that are not frightened. So that in a way is, I think he's shown it's true. And I think there'll be many people. There'll be a handful of people who have the information who are yet to come out.
I think that the truth can radicalize people. We oftentimes think that we have to make ideological jumps. It's not that they're not there, but I think that when you are provided the fact of a situation or the experience of a situation, it leaves an imprint. That's my own experience in my own way, even just covering the trial. The more I covered the the trial, the more I saw it wasn't being covered, the more I saw how flawed the coverage was or how mediocre it was, the more I understood how prejudicial the prosecution was. It became even more of a driving force to do it. So even in my own way, and I think that many of us can understand that, just even in the experience of reading about the leaks or the energy that it released in us, because I love this phrase from Martin Luther King, mesmerized by uncertainty. I think that when we don't have the facts and we see a bunch of talking heads sort of bitterly arguing with one another, and we're wondering, well, what side is more appropriate for the cocktail party that I'm going to so that I can get along with everyone. That kind of thinking that happens within people and just day-to-day life. With the facts or the experience of a thing, we can actually find the resources within ourselves, the capabilities within ourselves, and the motivation within ourselves. That energy is released. That's why propaganda is so powerful. That's why misinformation is so powerful. That's why we're in what I would consider to be a reformation to the secular age of information, where the priests selling favors are the talking heads on our television sets and on our computer screens. And when we can actually see the primary source document for ourselves, we can have, to sort of use that metaphor, the experience of, certainly in the traditional sense of the Reformation of God, directly, that's what Protestantism. And so too here, when we listen to the words of a detainee from Guantanamo Bay, or we see how bad the intelligence is, we don't have to get into the ideological bitch fest. We can just say, you know what, I'm not a mass murderer. I really don't agree that, I don't really want to be a part of extinguishing women and children in Pakistan. I know what the effects are of that, and that doesn't really feel right with me.
Well, that flows on something else that I wanted to ask you. You've been in Australia for some time now. I'm not sure if you saw the two newspapers a few days ago, both the Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald, the two most prestigious newspapers in the whole country, simultaneously ran the same story from AAP in the wake of the election, talking about how female politicians had new hairstyles. This is a serious press in Australia responding to an election. So I wanted to ask you about the American media. I mean, it is an extraordinary situation where here you have a trial that by any objective measure is of tremendous historical significance. But it seems not simply that the media was content to ignore what was taking place, but even more unexpectedly, I guess, or more bizarrely, it was often journalists themselves who were the most aggressive in attacking the whole idea of whistleblowers, attacking not only Manne but Snowden, Glenn Greenwald, anyone who seems to be ferreting out information. So what can you tell us about the state of American media? How do we get into this situation where the media that we rely on for information seems to be determined to ensure that we don't get information?
Are you asking me for my experience of the press, or
yeah, in respect of the Manning trial, yeah.
It's funny, I think about, well, why didn't people revolt in Eastern Germany? Or why didn't they revolt in the Soviet Union? And I studied it a little bit in university, so I sort of circled around those questions. I think that consumer pacification is clearly part of that. I mean, I think that a lot of people, I even speaking to Omar Dagayas, a former Guantanamo detainee, he said to me that, people are busy with their jobs and their lives, and so it sort of falls on the shoulders of a few journalists to actually, who have the time or have the resources to cover these things, because who can pay attention to it otherwise if they're raising children or they need to keep their job because they have to pay the rent. So, it's a mystery. I do believe that you can't crush the human spirit, but I also do believe that a lot of times people just, they're in a trance. And probably the answer to this question is sort of is a very ancient question, even when you have the knowledge. I mean, like, look at Alcibiades, Socrates' students. He's, becomes the biggest traitor to Athens. So philosophy and information and knowledge can be also dangerous. But in terms of my experience of the press, the sort of corporatized press in the United States, mainly through this trial, which is really where I interacted with them, they, in some ways, there's a generational shift. So you have more experience, let's say, mainstream publications like the New York Times. They're journalists, they've been around for 20 or 30 years, and they see people like me and Kevin Gastol, and they're like, these arrogant kids who think that, they have a Twitter account and they can do whatever the hell they want, or they're not very accurate. So, there was this, or the AP guy, whatever happened within the press pool was like a microcosm of what was happening writ large in these institutions. At first, the AP guy, I was almost arrested at Fort Meade in June. My first practically verbatim transcript came out because we could use computers, and I got my press credentials, and they were like, ooh. So they tried to arrest me for saying that I went to Smallwood Hall. Get this, we were suddenly not allowed to use Smallwood Hall anymore, which meant
What's Smallwood Hall?
It's where the Media Operations Center was. So they would broadcast on a feed Manning's trial. And in this room, you had Wi-Fi, you could use your computer. It was outside of the courtroom. So all the credentialed press would go into this room. And prior to that, I had been doing, basically stenography in a notebook. So early June, I was credentialed, and I decided that I was going to I had a bit of a disdain for the press. So I was credentialed before that, but I was like, all right, I'll finally go into this Media Operations Center and see what's up. So I get in there, and later in the month, I got back to Fort Meade, and there was no Media Operations Center, and we weren't allowed to use computers. In fact, for a whole year, the 3 journalists that were there, 3 or 4 journalists that were actually at the trial, for the whole trial, had no access to any computer. We were all in a notebook in the courtroom. So I went over, I didn't know if I had credentials because there were constant problems with trying to get access to this trial, even down to their servers at MDW, the Military District of Washington, which is the military district responsible for convening this trial. They had servers breaking down, their Microsoft server, their SharePoint server their websites kept falling apart, returning 404 errors. So I never got my email for my credentials. So I got to Fort Meade at 7 a.m. and I drove on basis public to go over to the public affairs office. And I go into the public affairs office and ask, am I credentialed? And they're like, well, we don't know. If you didn't get the email, you probably are not credentialed. So I was like, cool, that's not a satisfactory answer. So let me go find someone from public affairs. So I get permission, and I drive over to Smallwood Hall, where the Media Operations Center, and I walk inside, and there's this enormous cake in the middle of this auditorium where they broadcast in Guantanamo trials, and it says Happy Retirement. It was like something out of a Fellini film. And then suddenly the lady from Public Affairs drives over to the base, because I tweet out, reporters at the largest leak trial in U.S. history unable to use computers because of retirement party at Smallwood Hall. And that just infuriated the public affairs office. So they drove over, and they're like, how dare you go over here? And I had asked this Asian man at the public affairs office for permission. So there was this did she ask for permission? So coming back to the original reason why I brought this up, the AP guy was behind me, and they called law enforcement on me, a journalist at Fort Meade. And the courthouse news guy was also there. And I turned around to both of them and I said, I don't want to involve you in anything, but please don't leave me alone with law enforcement at Fort Meade. I'm a journalist. I'm here covering this trial. I work my butt off. Please don't leave me alone. And the AP guy almost left. He didn't, luckily, and they were going to get rid of me. And the law enforcement officer came in. I have the recording of it. I asked his permission and recorded the conversation. And it's really kind of bizarre and weird, and you should listen to it if you're interested in that sort of thing. But when the AP guy finally, about 30, he was going to arrest then the AP journalist because they wouldn't. The law enforcement officer insisted that I be left alone with him. And finally, the AP guy said, "Well, why do you need to be left alone with her if you're just going to talk to her?" And there was a kind of question about whether or not I was a journalist because I was a blogger. And so it's interesting because later on, flash forward a year, so I'm talking about the culture within the press pool as a microcosm of what happened outside. People respected the work that I produced. It actually helped a lot of reporters to cover the case. So I had certainly earned, at least on a personal level, respect. Kevin, myself, and Birgitta, John's daughter, a former volunteer for WikiLeaks who helped edit Collateral Murder, and Peter Hart, who's a media commentator in the United States. We did a panel, and the day after the panel, the AP guy walked up and he said, "Why didn't you tweet my name as being one of the people covering the trial?" And he was very angry at me. And I said, "Do you want me to be honest?" And I said, "Because your coverage is superficial, and you've been at this trial, and it shouldn't be superficial. You've been here for the last 2 years." And I said, "And you also almost left me with law enforcement early on." Because he started talking to me. He's like, "We should have solidarity in the press pool." And I said, "Well, solidarity in the press pool, you almost left me alone with law enforcement." And he said, "I'm sorry I did that." And we actually shook hands. And it was like a moment, there was a breakthrough, and then suddenly, like, the AP guy was like one of us, you know, like we took him, we took him into our small group. So there was definitely an institutional change even within the press pool. I hope that story was interesting to you guys.
So you mentioned before that the large media corporations, their business models fall down, they don't have the resources and all the rest of it. So do you see what you've been doing in this case as perhaps a harbinger of what's to come, that increasingly will be activists who are going out there and getting the stories that the media won't or can't cover anymore?
I think so. I mean, I consider myself a citizen. I mean, I take a little issue personally with the word activist because I feel like in the United States it's like a lifestyle. And so much of our citizenry, which is a public office, are, basically hibernating. So that's just within the sort of American culture. I think that we need vibrant citizens who are engaging in the polis, and that creates a healthy, civic society. But yes, I agree. I do think that people like me who feel a calling to cover unreported stories are going to continue to come forward. And I think also just even, when I look at like the future plans for the database that I've been collecting, it started as a timeline, then I got it into a MySQL database. Now I can actually architect the information out of the trial as I'm going on and continue my coverage of the WikiLeaks investigation. And then also, I mean, the goal for it this year is I'm working with an information architect and a user experience designer, separate from just simply continuing my narrative coverage and investigative coverage, is to actually create the type of infographics that will map the entire US investigation of WikiLeaks, every agency, every actor, everything. And I'm bringing on people to do that. So yes, I think that technology and also enlivened, sort of activists like myself who are sort of source journalists, primary source journalists. I got asked the other day if I was a propagandist. I'm like, there's nothing more objective than a transcript. It's like.
I mean, it's interesting what you're saying, really, that you're both an independent journalist but a scholar. I mean, the impulses are, in part, aren't they, that these things are known truly. And it does relate to what WikiLeaks does. And Jeff wanted to talk about this, and I'll raise it, which is that Julian Assange has this idea. I mean, I went back to look at how WikiLeaks got started, and it was really the thought that if information was accurately recorded and came into the world, it would open the eyes of people to truth and justice. That there are clouds of not knowing which are preventing the world progressing, but that if the primary sources could be published and the truth be known, then he called WikiLeaks the intelligence agency of the people, that the world would become a better place. It's incredibly idealistic. I mean, I wonder whether he still believes that. I think the problem he had at the beginning, and maybe you have this too, is not taking account of the laziness of so many people. That often I think, when so much information is given, Julian's assumption was that people would fall upon it and the truth would, set us free, as it were. And I just wonder whether, you have the same idea that somehow, and are you a bit disappointed with the lack of responsiveness to, the availability of truth?
It's funny. I would say that probably there are a couple of things that, Thoreau said that you only needed to read like one or two books really well in order to be educated. Not to, qualify my education. I mean, I'm certainly could, continue to read, but The Apology of Socrates and The Republic of Plato and Moby Dick are probably those 3 books that have changed my life. And The Apology of Socrates, I think, I have always had a fascination with it. So I would say that I was disappointed sometimes when I would get tweets. I turned into a bit of a misanthrope through this trial because I had no personal life. And I used to joke around like with my friends that not to take any of my ranting seriously. I'm just venting because I have there's no time for Alexa to relax. So if you catch me at the wrong hour on Twitter at 2 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes people will be saying things like, thank you, and I'm like, fuck you. And then I'd send them a direct message that's like, I'm just joking, I'm just totally, out of it. But there were times when they're like, we love your work so much. I'm like, why don't you freaking come down here and do these transcripts? Or why is this courtroom empty? But that was just really me being tired. I think fundamentally I knew that, look at a mob of Athenians would put Socrates to death. So I wasn't too surprised about that. I think also, I think that if you're really this question of education and knowledge, it's also kind of as much about fact and truth, sort of exoteric, let's say mathematics, as it is about seduction. It's those, like for example, to use a sort of poor metaphor, in order to educate, you have to have the stick and also the seduction. It's like, you have to round the children up and make sure they go to school and, put them in the corner if they get out of their chair and run around. So there's all those elements to education as well. And I think there's a difference between information and knowledge. I was joking around with someone the other night. I was like, if only the public en masse could take some notes from the UFO community about their interest in WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has no problem with the UFO community. They are fascinated with WikiLeaks documents. So yes and no.
There was just an info done about that area, whatever it is, where all the UFOs, wasn't there? Yeah, that's what. Well, following on from that, I guess, when you talk about that, I think of that famous Kundera quote about the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. But it does seem there are 2 ways of thinking about that. There's the sense that the knowledge will be there forever and for history and posterity, and truth will come out eventually. But there's also the more activistic kind of, that the truth will make a difference here and now. So following on from that second part, what is the perception of Manning now in the US? What is the public sentiment as a result of the coverage that you and others have been doing? How is it being received, and how is how has that been moving?
I think for the most part, en masse, most people don't know who Manning is. And they don't know who Assange is, and even individuals in IT. And that's my sense of it, just the general populace. They know of it sort of peripherally because they saw maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes of the Give Me documentary. I think that my sense of it also is that Assange certainly would have not had an easier time had he been an American, but the fact that he's not American is really counts against him in terms of public perception, because Americans don't tend to like foreigners. We're sort of getting the better of them. We're very proud people. But within the communities that do know about these issues, I think that when Manning announced that she would like to be referred to from now on as she and Chelsea, certainly, a lot of activists sort of took that issue up. But those sort of more fundamental issues, I think that the beginning of a larger societal debate, which this first part is just educating people about what the landscape looks like. What is the surveillance state? We can't really find solutions to these things if it's not properly diagnosed. Similarly with Occupy. We can talk about organizing and labor and left and right, and I was an activist in the 90s, so I know how to organize, or my dad in the 70s and 80s, who thinks that everybody is just arrogant under a certain age and doesn't know what the hell they're doing and they're rude and all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, if we don't understand even what our class structure is today, how can we possibly figure out how to organize people? So we're in that part of the debate, and I think Greenwald has really pushed this ball down the field with Snowden's leaks of really explaining to the public at large what this surveillance state looks like, how it includes all of the aspects of society moving on to the internet, the things that Assange has said, and cypherpunks, and all those kinds of things. So we're in that educational process now.
Can I just say something and get both Jeff and Alexa to comment on it if they wish? I mean, it struck me, for a long time I taught in part about Eastern Europe, and I was pessimistic about anything changing, and then at a certain point the whole thing collapsed. And for me, my favourite author in there was Václav Havel and The Power of the Powerless, and I taught students for years and years and that essay. Some of you here might know it. But it struck me for a long time, and I would often say to students that the contemporary democratic state can absorb the normal kind of radical left movements, like the anti-globalisation movement. In a way, I think the contemporary democratic capitalist state shrugs its shoulders when people protest in the normal way against globalisation, and it kind of doesn't. I mean, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but it seems to me it doesn't make much difference to anything. What really struck me, and I'd be interested in other views on this, is that, as I said this at Sydney, that I think Assange has found a method of possible transformation which the contemporary state can't shrug at. I think that's his genius, that he saw the possibility in the age of the internet of what leaking individuals with access to vast amounts of sensitive information, what they could do, and he theorised about it right at the beginning of WikiLeaks. I think, and in a way I think even more than the case of Manning, Edward Snowden case is the exemplary case of the transformative potential that Julian Assange had in mind. That is to say, here is someone who's sitting not even in the NSA, but in an agency which has access to NSA information. And I take it because of his conscience, said, this is astonishing. No one knows that the NSA is hoovering up the entire email, telephone, etc. traffic of the citizenry, and decides that he can't live with it, and finds the journalist in the world most likely to treat it with authenticity and courage, Glenn Greenwald, in the newspaper that's likely to go with it without temporising, The Guardian. And I said this in Sydney, I'll say it again, you have now the situation where, in this case, at least the elite in America, including the chief of American intelligence, is saying we've probably gone too far, we've made a mistake. And the issue is on the table. The issue of, and I can't think of a more important issue apart from climate change for people to think about than what's happening to privacy in the age of the internet when the state has control. And it seems to me that I don't know whether you agree with this, but that somehow the WikiLeaks idea has the potential to change things in a way that I think more traditional forms of left activity haven't.
Go, you go.
Well, just very quickly, I mean, if someone had said to you 20 years ago that would be this revelation that the state was eavesdropping on absolutely every communication that you made, that they had searchable databases and all the rest of it, you would have predicted, had these revelations been made, that there would be villagers with pitchforks storming the halls of governance. And in some ways, it does seem to me that one of the curious things is how muted the reaction has been. And I wonder, you made the comparison before of climate change. I wonder if the situation is that precisely because the situation seems so extreme now, that doesn't necessarily inspire people to take action. That's why I'm interested in the Occupy Wall Street moment, because even these protests were quite small, and you can obviously talk more about this, but for a minute we had some sort of hope that things might change, and I wonder if that's just as important as motivating people as being exposed to the extremity of the threats that we face.
I'm not sure what I'm answering right now. Could you ask that in again, or say, or yeah?
Just the importance of the possibility of hope, the possibility of change, as opposed to simply information about the threat that we face.
It's hard for me to sometimes answer these questions because I always have to take it back to being authentic and being honest about my own life and my own. I mean, what we're asking about right now is what is it, the good life and the good society, and these are ancient questions. But to sort of maybe make it simpler and less abstract and maybe more useful for this discussion, clearly, if you want to have a democratic state, you have to have executive power because there are threats, and you have to have virtue in the people, which means they have to be informed enough about politics and their interests and have some wisdom and some interest and stake in the longevity and the stability of society. And what we have right now currently in the United States, for example, in my own country, is we have an executive that is owned by the same entrenched interests as the Congress. The Congress is uninformed. They do not deliberate. And I mean, they were complaining about citizens deliberating in a public square. Well, if Congress did its job, we wouldn't have to have gone to the public square. It's really simple. And really, actually, we had a whole generation, I think, of young people who had a learning curve because they didn't know how to deliberate necessarily. They didn't know how to organize. So they were getting their experience around that. What does that look like, especially for the game generation or the internet generation, which organize completely different than, let's say, my parents' generation, which organizes with heavy social capital. The game or the internet generation has myriad weak social ties, like scientists or artists. Because most of these young kids coming out of school, if you were talking about that class, they work in the media, they work in IT, they're consummate consumers of electronic information. And so, they also have this kind of belief, even if you look at the organizational values within corporations, they tend to think that if I have all these tools, I can be anything. The dot-com bubble was sort of built on that. If I have everything that I need, I can be a CEO. Occupy was kind of like the dot-com bubble a little bit, where it's like if I have all these things, we can make a difference. Maybe there's other ingredients missing in there. Part of it is experience. And then you had this sort of myopia within Occupy because you had these younger kids who were organizing, with swarms around certain pieces of information on the internet who didn't want the blood contract. And then you had the unions who, in the United States, for example, are very weak. The rank and file members weak. The unions don't belong to rank and file members. They haven't really protected the American worker. And there's a distrust around a lot of unions. And then the largest class in the United States is the service sector, which is completely ununionized. So you had all these sort of various sects and factions and class coming together. And then there was this sort of idea of like, the kind of reform is a little bit beyond the political. We need structural reform. This is why Snowden's leaks, I think, are fundamentally important. Reestablishing the Fourth Amendment, reestablishing due process, reestablishing structural elements which the left and the right should both be, vested in. But how can you possibly have a public debate between the left and the right to kind of come to some kind of compromise, excluding all the hot button issues like abortion, women's rights, identity politics, all those kinds of things, when the media, which is where we had that discussion, will prevent the public. So there's all these various pieces of the puzzle, and all of those various pieces have to come together in order to have the kind of political reform. But it starts with, I think what you're saying is fundamentally true, it starts with the media. I think WikiLeaks is so vitally important, the survival of WikiLeaks or the US government backing down, revolution in the media, because we will have no public debate until that happens.
Can I push you on a very concrete question, which you know a lot about, but I don't think many people in Australia know much about, which is the legal process, the grand jury investigation that's taken place into WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, which I don't think people in Australia know what's happened and the threat that he's under and his organisation is under. Could you say something about that?
I spoke to the Department of Justice, specifically the Public Affairs Office at the Eastern District of Virginia, which is where the grand jury has been impaneled, the day after Manne was convicted, and the criminal investigation into WikiLeaks continues. Because I am very familiar with the court record for the Manne trial, 7 civilians have been investigated by the FBI. They include, quote, the founders, owners, and managers of WikiLeaks. There is no question that the U.S. government is doing everything in its power to neutralize WikiLeaks, and they're doing it through 2 processes. One has to understand that when James Clapper, who you mentioned before, saying that suddenly he's discovering that there is possibly a relevant discussion needed about the U.S. government surveilling the world, he's the Director of National Intelligence. And in 2012, in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee, 2 very powerful committees in the U.S. Congress, that WikiLeaks is a worldwide counterintelligence threat to the national security of the United States. You can bet that the intelligence community has been investigating and trying to neutralize WikiLeaks. The arms of U.S. national power have been honed in the entire interagency executive process to neutralize WikiLeaks: diplomacy, information, military, economic, finance, intelligence, and law enforcement. The law enforcement prong is the Department of Justice. It's one prong of U.S. national power. When the U.S. government needs to neutralize a terrorist, they don't bring them into a court of law generally. What they'll do is they'll strangle their network, they'll strangle their finances, they will infiltrate them, they will neutralize them. It's all, you have to remember, the executive is extrajudicial. I mean, it applies power however it will until it's stopped or checked by either the judiciary or the Congress, which is not doing that in the United States post 9/11. In terms of the judicial process with regards to WikiLeaks, the investigation is ongoing, and one need to only look at espionage or trials, sort of investigations like this. I mean, they take 6 to 10 years. I mean, the U.S. government will wait until it has Assange in their hands before they unseal any indictment. I will say this. I've gone down to the clerk's office. I've pulled every search warrant under seal within that district since 2010. And according to the prosecutors, when an indictment is unsealed or the case goes away, all the WikiLeaks electronic communications orders for Dynadot, Twitter, I mean, there's Google, Facebook, all of the ISPs, Internet Service Providers, will be unsealed. All the search warrants that are attached to every 2703D order, because in the Eastern District of Virginia, they go in pairs. There's a metadata order, the clerks, a metadata order. There's definitely a search warrant. That's according to the clerks. And in fact, the clerks there are very interesting. They had to actually instantiate a new sort of protocol for this list of electronic communications order as a result of the WikiLeaks investigation. It's changed their whole way of handling these normal legal documents in the court. And there are over 800 electronic communications orders, and I can't confirm this with them, but the indications that the clerks gave me is they all relate to the WikiLeaks investigation.
What's your theory as to why people don't know that this is happening?
In which population, just in general?
Yeah, I would think people in the States don't know about it. Certainly people in Australia don't.
I think people in the States know about it a little bit more, in the sense that I don't think you have the denialism that you have in the British press, which, I mean, there's a reason I didn't respond to it for a year, because it's like crazy talk. I mean, there is no question that the U.S. is investigating WikiLeaks. So when it gets into this kind of weird discussion in foreign press about whether or not it exists or not, I'm like, it's almost like I didn't want to waste my time. I don't know how to talk to crazy. That's kind of like where I'm at. And I'm not going to waste, there's so much work that needs to be done. I'm not going to waste my time convincing some idiot that the U.S. government is...
I know this will rile you, but I have thought about the Alex Gibney film, which allowed, insofar as people in Australia know something now about WikiLeaks, it'll probably be influenced by that film. And the assumption of the film is that Julian Assange is paranoid in thinking that the American state is out to get him. And I've read every review of the film, and virtually everyone who reviews the film and writes about it accepts Gibney's case is fair-minded, well-balanced between pro and anti-Assange forces. I mean, you've told us, and it is sort of transparently obvious, that a massive legal action is underway under seal. What in the hell is going on?
There's a reason why Alex Gibney has never written me a letter despite my review. Because he knows that he doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, I say this kind of like, who gives a fuck what Alex Gibney thinks? I mean, now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a PR battle, apparently, for certain interests. I mean, it certainly doesn't bode well for freedom of the press or for WikiLeaks as an institution if this kind of misinformation is going around. But in terms of the fact of it, it's like, Alex Gibney doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, but I mean, Julian Assange knows it matters. He produced a fantastic, almost 200-page annotated reply to it, because there is a battle for public opinion that has to go on. And now there's a new film, The Fifth Estate, which is based on Dom Scheidberg's account and the book that The Guardian produced on this, and they both ended up being hostile to Assange. And again, I think there's going to be a battle for public opinion over this matter. But what strikes me as really interesting is the way in which misinformation can be taken so easily and not combated effectively. And I don't quite know what to think about that.
People like to hear themselves talk. I mean, that's what I think it boils down to. And they like to feel important. And that's what it boils down to. And they like to sort of have an opinion on things and share it, even if they're misinformed. I mean, I think that sort of makes up most of the American press. I think that I don't mean to downplay how important it is that the facts actually do get out, because the stakes are very high. But that, to me, is more of a... one needs to look at the role of Hollywood in general, and I think that the solution is structural as much as it is a sort of perhaps a PR issue. What I mean by PR issue is an information campaign to educate people. I wrote a review of the film, and...
So you give a shit about Gibney too?
I wrote a review of the film, and Alex Gibney, despite the fact that, my review was pretty biting, and I also was at the National Press Club when the film came out, and I stood up in the middle of Adrian Lamo's, tears crawling down his face, and said this, he's a fucking liar. Adrian Lamo turned in Bradley Manning after a hypothetical subjunctive question. What would you do if you had access to such and such a blah, blah, blah? That's when Adrian Lamo reportedly, from his own testimony, contacted law enforcement. But, putting all that stuff aside, Alex Gibney knows, even when the New York Times called me an activist, he, tweeted out that I've been hazed by Alexa O'Brien, but I could never say she's not a journalist. Let's talk about Hollywood. Let's talk about the fact that the largest growth sector for many of the camera companies in the U.S. are federal contracts for lensing and weapons systems. Let's talk about the processors in the consumer electronic market and video games, which drive the development for the processors on the digital battlefield. The U.S. U.S. Navy is able to control the oceans because of its its reconnaissance software and applications in space-based reconnaissance. That didn't make any sense. Sorry, guys. The U.S. hegemony is built on information and its military. The U.S. Information media is the only service sector that has a trade surplus with every nation in the world. The U.S. government understands how important it is to control the information space. It's become more important. Surveillance is just one component of that. It's also about controlling populations. I quoted an excerpt from a paper written at the U.S. War College about how most of the publics need to be mobilized because many people are engaging in war as a spectator now. so all of these factors are happening, and when we look at Hollywood, when Hollywood figures out, this is how you solve it, when Hollywood figures out that the movie about WikiLeaks that's really going to go viral is the one that actually properly reports and isn't just simply old media trying to hold on to its research and development from 20 years ago, then I think we're going to find a solution. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It does.
But I mean, it's in Australia, it's not just the media. Of course, every Australian politician who's asked about Julian Assange also repeats this story that there's no legal case, as far as we know, it's all paranoia and all the rest of it. What you said, that the American government is tremendously concerned about WikiLeaks, and it's happening on all of these fronts, legal, political, and all the rest of it. So what happens now? I mean, at the moment there's a stalemate. Assange is in the embassy, all the rest of it. The American government is relentless. How does this play out? What is the next stage for Assange?
I mean, what happens next is more leaks. That's what happens next. More leaks, continuing to the journalists like myself who, sort of essentially been cutting our teeth on trials like the Manning trial or other events. We've evolved and we've gotten a lot of experience over the last couple of years. And I think that we're, just like the U.S. government, we're also learning where to go in the next, in the next place. And for me, I know I need to basically work with an information architecture and user experience designer to be able to take the information that I've amassed and communicate that in different narratives in the digital realm, as well as doing more traditional pieces like writing a book about the Manning trial. I think also for Assange, I mean, it's the goal is for the U.S. government to back down. That's the goal. Anything that makes that happen is what needs to happen next.
We should let people ask questions in a minute, but I've got a couple of questions, or things I'd like you to tell people about because they're interesting. One is how it came that you were threatened with the sort of charge that you were connected to Al-Qaeda. Believe it or not, I couldn't believe it when I read about it. But
me neither.
Is it possible to just say what happened?
I hope my voice isn't like really droning on everybody. And then I said, all right.
No. It's not, I promise.
Okay, so I had been covering Bahrain in the live blog in 2011, the Shia protests, and it was a very popular live blog because...
You were there?
No. There was really no Western journalists. I was just much like many of the individuals who were engaged in social media during, the revolutions in MENA. It just so happened at the website that I worked on, it was a contributor website that published people like Tanis Jabana from Balkan Leaks and Heather Marsh and myself. That I pulled out the Bahrain straw, and that's what I was going to cover every day. So I was covering that, and I was doing that quite successfully because the blog was very popular because the Western press had been kicked out. And I was able to sort of filter through social media sort of what was propaganda and what was probably a credible first stage report. And my pieces got picked up by Al Jazeera, The Stream, and the BBC at times. So, many people would refer to this. At the same time, I was extramurally, because I had a full-time job working in IT at that point, I was starting to organize the original occupation of Wall Street. So it started off with being contacted by a federal agent telling me that they had received, it was a friend who received an email saying that the organization that I helped found, which was focused on electoral reform, namely reforming campaign finance in the United States, and actually, quotes the Federalist Papers. The joke was Al-Qaeda, the Federalist Papers have Al-Qaeda written all over it. But he said, I received this this email from DHS that says that you're infiltrated with cyber terrorists. And I know that's totally crazy, so just wanted to give you a heads up. And then Jason Leopold, the journalist, contacted me and said that he had seen other documents, higher classification from different agencies saying something similar. And then I was in a business meeting at work with the head of federal contracts. I was building out a part of the website as a content strategist and an information architect. And he said, by the way, he's a former Army interrogator, BTW, and he said, they're asking about you. And I said, oh, I know about the DHS memo, don't worry. I was at work, so I was trying to keep my private life separate from my life at work. I was like, oh yeah, I know about the DHS memo, don't worry, that's all under control. He's like, no, Alexa, they're asking about you by name. So then a private security contractor contacted me, or contacted the Twitter profile DM and said, your website was found on an Al-Qaeda recruitment website. And then published an article saying that we were infiltrated with jihadists. There was 2 articles in their private security magazines. The other one said we were infiltrated with low-level jihadists, and this one said we were infiltrated with Al-Qaeda. And so it was quite absurd. I mean, it was ridiculous at first. But it was interesting education for me, because when I told people this, who had known me, they all knew that I had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. But they were scared. And I remember when the secretary got put on this database job, and I was really the only IT person in the company, I knew something was up. And I called up the CEO, who was a family friend, and said, what's up? I know something's up. And he said that people were freaking out because, it's definitely not good for business. So I had to leave my job. I came to an arrangement. I left my job, and then I was invited onto the Hedges suit against President Obama for the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which allows for the indefinite detention of anyone anywhere in the world. No trial, no charges, you, me, everybody. If you're suspected of terrorism, connections to terrorism. There's vague language. It moves material support from the authorization for use of military force to this new phrase called substantial support. And support's an expressive word. If you're a journalist like me, and I had actually spoken to former Guantanamo detainees that the U.S. government considers to be terrorists, according to the State Department terrorist list, or recidivists because they publish anti-Guantanamo documentaries. Does that mean I substantially support Al-Qaeda? And also activism. If I start a group and the government wants to get rid of those reformers and links us to Al-Qaeda, some private security contractor with ties to the FBI, which they had, and then the more came out in the Stratfor release. Fred Burton, who was the head of counterterrorism at Stratfor, was asked by a guy named Thomas Kolpecki from another private security firm to tie the group that I helped found to Saudi Islamic fundamentalists. I mean, it was just getting crazier and crazier. First of all, it's what they do in any totalitarian regime. You're not allowed to go to university. Your jobs go away. I mean, I'm a normal, average, everyday citizen, and I'm being essentially neutered for engaging in the polls.
Shall we go then?
Can I just ask one more, and then we go? Say a little bit about the legal action you're taking with. A little bit about the legal action you're taking with Noam Chomsky and others over what's called the
National
Defense Authorization Act.
So we sued Obama over this National Defense Authorization Act, and we won in the Southern District because it violated.
Say what the act.
Yeah, the clause in the National Defense Authorization Act that allows the government to detain anyone anywhere for suspicion of terrorism. No trial, no charges. They can put you in any country. They can extradite you anywhere. They can do whatever the hell they want. They think they can do that. So we won because it violates the First Amendment, because it chills speech. If I'm a journalist and there's the threat of this this legislation hanging over my head, do you think I'm going to be more careful about what I publish? It chills my freedom of speech. And also due process. The government prosecutors kept talking about habeas as being due process. I mean, habeas just is a jailer explaining to the public or to your, defense attorney why you're in jail. And it takes years. I mean, look at the Guantanamo trial. It took years and years and years to get any information about why people are being detained. So we won, and then in midnight appeal, Obama, who basically sold the American public this abomination of legislation by this stupid signing statement that has no legal precedent, where he said that he wouldn't use it. And he's, to prove how arbitrary executive power is, the minute we won in the Southern District, he immediately appealed. His Justice Department appealed our case, and we went to the Second Circuit. Those judges overturned our earlier victory. In the lower court, they said that Hedges and I had no fear, we had standing, we had credible fear, but that the legislation was unconstitutional because it violated the First and Fifth Amendments. Then, in the Second Circuit, those judges said, well, O'Brien and Hedges have no reason to fear because they're American citizens, and Congress can't pass laws that allow for the military detention of civilians. But Kaiwargala from Occupy London and Birgit John's daughter, non-American citizens, do have reason to fear. So it was thrown out, and now we've made application to the Supreme Court to overturn this legislation. But while we're fighting this in the judiciary, Congress continues to pass laws like this. So, the root problem is our entire political system is corrupted with campaign finance and entrenched interests that own our military and our national power and are preying on the resources of citizens, not only the resources but the spirits of citizens, by passing this abomination of these horrible pieces of legislation.
Just if I can say one thing, and then we'll have questions. At the moment in the Senate, this was discussed in Sydney, there is a beginning of a bill, I suppose, to distinguish between real journalism, which is defined, and that activity, which is collecting primary sources and releasing them to the public, which is not journalism, which Julian Assange calls rightly the Assange clause. Right. And so a bit of legislation is now being begun, it's not clear that it will get through, that is being considered, which would allow journalism to continue, presumably because of the Constitution, but would make what Assange does a possible unlawful act, as I would think is a preparation for the trial eventually, which they want to hold. Anyhow, it's again what the kind of thing you're saying, and all of this.
The Senate calls it the Assange clause.
The Assange, do they?
The Senate Judiciary. That Assange didn't make that up.
And all of this goes on. One of my story about the Murdoch press. No one in Australia will hear about any of this activity. All of this is going on in public, and we don't know what's happening, except for people like you. Can we now? Is there someone who could take a?
Yeah, we've got one.
Is everyone still awake?
If there are any questions.
First, I just want to thank Alexa for coming out to Australia. It's been so wonderful. We've known each other online since we've known, and it's so great to have you here. So thank you very much, and thank you to Jeff and Robert for coming and doing this tonight. One of the things that really concerns me is that as Australian citizens, we are so intertwined into American foreign policy in so many ways, and not only through the sort of militarisation of our relationship both with bases up in the Northern Territory, our seeming willingness to follow you guys into war without parliamentary votes, but with things like the NDAA, which a lot of us probably in this room are probably more informed about than the average citizen. And it really concerns me that America can apply an unconstitutional domestic law to a global citizenry, just as they can also decide to drone bomb people outside, American citizens included these days. So I guess my question to you, because I'm very, very grateful to all of you that are fighting this in America. It's a huge deal. But I wonder in terms of the NDA class action that you're taking, will it have any capacity to stop foreign citizens from being held, detained indefinitely, or will the application, let's hope that you're successful, will it only apply to American journalists or citizens, so the rest of us are still a threat, so to speak, or will we have an application about, I don't know of any other country that voted for America to apply this law to us, so I'm just curious whether there is anything within the class action that actually enables the global citizenry to be protected from this.
It's hard to say because it depends on basically what the legal. I haven't read the application to SCOTUS. I mean, we do have foreign nationals as well as U.S. citizens on this particular suit for a reason, for that very reason. It depends on the interpretation of the court, fundamentally. I think what I would stress here to answer your question is it's really vital. There is a weak electorate in the United States, and even in the Manning case, it's really going to take international action to be able to check the U.S. executive. I wouldn't, certainly rely on that responsibility on the shoulders of the American public. We ourselves have a difficult time trying to control our own government. I think what's really important is that the U.S. not be allowed to continue to erode international law. Even in the downing of the Bolivian president's plane, I mean, first of all, it's poor statesmanship that outside of that, completely destructive to the very delicate fabric of the anarchical society, which is global politics. And I think that once you to even say it more starkly, the U.S. has already passed into a totalitarian state. It's vital that you not rely on some kind of enlightened citizenry within the U.S. to protect your own rights. That you,
Scary.
It's scary, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
Hello, thanks for coming and sharing your experience. Well, I kind of already answered my question, but still I'm going to ask it. Do you think there is any opportunity George Bush would ever be tried for war crimes? Is there any even thinking among some group of activists or citizens? I think he was accused in Malaysia of war crimes.
He was charged in the ICC, but he didn't turn up. That was John Howard.
Yeah.
The charges were entered in.
Listen, I'll bring it back to the Manning trial. The UN Special Rapporteur on torture said that Manning's treatment at Quantico was cruel and inhumane. And defense had tried to have Juan Mendez come into court to elucidate for the judge where these observations, this sort of analysis came from, et cetera, et cetera. The judge did allow for the documents to be submitted as evidence, but did not allow for live testimony from Juan Mendez because the UN Special Rapporteur's testimony in the UN has no power over an American court. Obama is concerned about, in his rhetoric and his sophistry to the public, about chemical weapons being used in Syria. If the U.S. was really actually interested in upholding international norms, it would join the International Criminal Court. So I would say that if I were to wager a bet at OTV, probably not, to answer your question about George Bush. But if you really felt that you could, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you'd have to probably organize it, like this gentleman in front of you said, to try to make it very difficult for George Bush to travel outside the United States.
Thanks very much. When you were speaking about the incompetency of major media to speak to the failures of do you think there's any sort of structural policy within those major media companies that might make it easier for them to, an independent journalist to use them as an avenue to get information out. For example, in 1911, it was decided then somehow that we have an editor for a newspaper who would sort of be able to control it. And I know that speaks to the C word being conspiracy, that there might be one person in control of the newspaper and the articles and what have you, but wouldn't it make it easier for there to be more streams of information? Just as an idea, has been thought about maybe changing the structural ways in which major media companies are operating?
So let me make sure I understand your question. Are you suggesting that if you had a mainstream media organization like The Guardian, and they opened their audience up to writers on the internet by having an editor who you could submit to?
Rather than not having an editor, so there wasn't a safeguard for someone to say, no, we shouldn't publish that or talk about that issue. Why have that constraint?
You know, editors are actually, putting aside the political issue, I actually enjoyed writing for, you might surprise you, but the Daily Beast, because I had a great editor, Harry Siegel, who's now with the New York Daily News. Politically, he didn't ever censor me or try to censor me with regards to my coverage. But, there are stylistic issues, especially for someone like me who tends to be very granular. It can help me get it up there. I don't think that the editor in and of itself is a bad idea, unless it's like other editors, because I was offered to write at other publications prior, where you're dealing with the politics of the situation, and I almost sometimes, I preferred to publish on my blog because I could write whatever I wanted. I guess it would depend on whether or not your solution actually increases the reach of a piece, and also filters it enough so that people are not, the internet is a glutted marketplace, so things can get lost in obscurity as well.
Can I say something?
Speaking as a professional editor, I'd like to just suggest that we're not actually bad guys, we do actually play useful roles sometimes.
Kill the editors, kill the poets.
In a way, the world is as you say, which is that the people can, and more or less are free to write whatever they want, and they appear in hundreds and thousands of blogs or whatever. The reason what you're saying is the reason that what you say is interesting is that people get to rely on some outlets, and for example, if they come to believe in The Guardian, as I've come to, as the best newspaper in the English-speaking world, then things that get to The Guardian you're more likely to read and have a better chance of reading than on all sorts of blogs where the same material might appear. And so that, the question then is you go to The Guardian because you kind of trust it. We now have a situation where great luxury of electronic publication where the ridiculous lengths of things, where everything had to be short, is no longer the case. So you could have, I think, you need editors, because without editors people don't know who to trust or don't get to know who to trust. But if you have good newspapers, electronic newspapers, they can now publish stuff at very great length. And we are in a position where you could have a more informed public if we were not sort of entertaining ourselves to death, and if people were willing to put in the effort. This is one of the things I was saying earlier, that both Alexa's extraordinarily good blog or website and the material that WikiLeaks produces, its faith is in a citizenry that is sufficiently willing to do the hard work, to read at great length, not to feel... And I think that's, you can, everything is able to be put out on the internet. You need, electronic newspapers or really good blogs like the Daily Beast or whatever, because people need to know where to go in order to get what they want. And I think we're in a position where you could have an incredibly well-informed public if a citizenry was willing to put the work in to read. But then you have editors, because editors are the ways in which you get guided here, not there, as everyone's time is limited.
Can I tell a story?
Yeah.
I used to love to psych out the media that were not familiar to the Manne prosecution, because they would come in and they'd say, where do you write for? I'm like, my weblog. And they would try to be polite and be like, oh, okay, alexaobrien.com.
That's what I mean, you got it out, and you didn't have an editor. It seems to me that there might be an institutional sort of thing whereby we're not supposed to challenge, I don't know, too much.
It's on. It's on now, is it? It's on. It's not now. It's very weird. What's that?
Gel.
Project. I'll project. Okay, I'll project. So we've got a situation, I'll just use you as a bit of an oracle at the moment, Alexa, because you've been in the very particular position of focusing pretty much on one issue for 3 years. Most people don't get an opportunity these days to just concentrate for that long, and it tends to clarify things, and particularly an issue of absolutely central global importance. When we look at the situation, WikiLeaks comes along, therefore private manning can happen, and therefore Edward Snowden can happen. Then we're opened up to a situation where we're presented by a vast and overwhelming problem, total surveillance. And as somebody got into activism through Occupy, activism is of course the most depressing thing you can ever get involved in. Because you've constantly been thoroughly defeated and you just have to suck it up. Recently this week spoke to a long-term activist, and he mentioned to me that what he was interested in getting involved in, if he wanted to get re-involved, would be long-term campaigning. And this reminded me of something that Vince Emanuele said from Iraq Veterans Against the War when he was here recently, that the people we are struggling against are planning 50, 60 years out routinely, and we should be doing the same thing. And this all came together suddenly for me. We're presented with this vastness of a multitude of an absolute clusterfuck. That possibly is easier to understand if we give it a frame that's, say, 60 years into the future. That's as far as what do you think of that kind of the framing problem?
I think it's very smart. I mean, but there are also questions about it. Like, for one thing, I would hope there's a joke. Actually, I happen to love Václav Havel, to tell you the truth. The Power of the Powerless is probably the essay. I'll add that to 3 books. My former political science professor used to say that I considered it like self-help for Europe because I was really moved by the essay. But anyway, the reason I brought that up is because there's this sort of anecdote that Havel has about these Western peace activists who go to the former Czechoslovakia with this petition, and they want to get signatures from dissidents. Will you sign this petition? And none of the Czechoslovakians would sign it, and because they kept saying, well, who's going to die under that flag? So, there's a joke, sort of like, especially I think with many people who experience the kind of totalitarianism of the former Eastern Bloc countries or the Soviet Union, there's a sort of skepticism about, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, so to speak. But putting that sort of caution aside, I think that it's a really smart thing to do, because I think it also will help clarify the activists or the citizens' own perceptions of what's important and what exactly it is, and it can help others in discourse be able to have the kind of deliberation where you can get clarity around what are the most important things, what are the priorities, what are the kind of structures that we need to build, and how do we actually practically enact and build those structures to get to the kind of goal that we're after, especially when it comes to things like natural resources or the information space. I'm sure in many regards that one could, going back to what you said earlier about Assange, and WikiLeaks, is sort of the theory behind the the mechanism and the political philosophy behind the mechanism. I mean, all those kinds of things can only bring, I think, good to, even if it's just the activist or the group. Of course, the government will probably call you a terrorist, but anyway, that's another problem.
I mean, can I just, your comment about activism, being terribly depressing, and I take it's depressing because you get nowhere, is the thought. This is the thing that struck me about Assange.
Well, that's what it feels like in the short term.
I know, but what I was trying to say earlier, and I think it's quite important for people, I imagine many people in this audience are on the left, that he actually got somewhere. I mean, it struck me, I was just, in a way, during the Snowden affair, which Snowden was only indirectly, I think, influenced by WikiLeaks, but I'm sure he was indirectly influenced by WikiLeaks. At a certain point, what Snowden did, but then Assange sent one of his people, Sarah Harrison, to help Assange get from Hong Kong to Russia, and then she, and I don't know how it happened, was able to convince the Russian government, for whatever nefarious reasons probably, were willing to offer asylum to Snowden. There was a sort of momentary crisis in the relations between Russia and the United States. Well, that's really what WikiLeaks and Snowden have managed to do. So that's not ineffectual. I mean, it seems to me just incredible that Assange sitting in the Ecuadorian embassy with basically no resources except wit and the loyalty of a few people and the electronic means of communication, how much he's been able to achieve. So that's what I'm trying to contrast WikiLeaks to, say, the anti-globalisation movement, where I would think a really serious member of the anti-globalisation movement would often feel, we don't seem to be getting anywhere. And this, I think, is the sort of political genius of this hard-headed political thinker, Assange, that he's managed to get somewhere without anything except native wit, really, and courage, and a kind of vision of justice and his sense how the world might be made a better place. So I think he's a very, very interesting, for that reason, very interesting person. And I think that, if I can say, Alexa's done an incredible thing in documenting and chronicling the Manning case. And the world is a much better place. Who knows what, in the long term, that will lead to? No one can know. But the world is a much better place for, your 14 or 16 hours a day of work. And, so these for me are the great stories of hope. In a way that is a sort of hopeful story set in the Western context.
Completely is.
Alexa, you mentioned your co-litigator, Chris Hedges, recently, and indicated that you were with him in the court cases against the Defence Act. His book, The Death of the Liberal Classes, is the most depressingly accurate assessment of the crisis that we all face. And I'm a 40-odd-year journey on that activism road, comrade, and I remain a revolutionary optimist today, despite all the shit kickings that we've had and all the defeats we've had and all the step backwards we've had, all the compromises we've been forced to enter into. But that notion of revolutionary optimism is boosted by the very objective conditions that you're talking about. I mean, the struggle in Syria, the struggle in Tunisia, the struggle in Egypt, they're all part and parcel of that struggle against imperialism. They don't yet quite understand it in the way in which some of us who have a bit more of a theoretical understanding do. But nevertheless, it seems to me that there is a moment emerging in which offensive action, rather than defensive action, is actually what's called for. And you called for more leaks. And I think that's the first step towards it. But it's also, we've got to start to say to the Occupy movement and to the Indignados and all those people, here is a way in which we can start to actually fire gunshots across the bows of the genuine power brokers. The financial marketplace, which has invented commodities that are now the reason why manufacturing and other real industries can't return to some level of development is because finance capital has become so embedded in its own milieu of making more and more paper money. So why don't we start to talk to the people who have these skills and say, let's start to bring down HSBC. Let's start to create some mayhem that gives actually some space in which organisations like Occupy, like the Indignados, like the Arab Springs, have all got then a general campaign offensive behind which they can start to manoeuvre even more broadly than they currently are capable of doing.
You're talking about, and I hear you, you're talking about the dilemma of political education. I think that we are beginning to have a debate about the commons in the digital realm. I mean, the Pirate Party is a perfect example of that. I mean, when property becomes the genes in our body, the ideas in our head, then, something I've said before, our essentially 18th century institutions, 18th century philosophy, 19th century institutions, and 20th century outlook presents us with a vision we can't afford to build on, bank on, or believe in. But that's a process, and I think that we're starting to do that. I mean, part of it's just, the reason why it starts with the media is because oftentimes when people hear, let's say my neighborhood, I live in a working class neighborhood, it's the multicultural pot of America. There are more languages spoken in the borough of Queens than anywhere else in the United States. It's like modern day Rome in a certain way. When they hear what you just said, they're like, whatever, they just don't get it. And these are working class people who oftentimes belong to unions, many of them are tradesmen. Their children have all gone into finance. That's their hope for their children, is that they go work on Wall Street and retire in Long Island. So I think we need to also talk about this in a way, once again, that's practical for people that understand, so they can understand what you're talking about. And that's sort of the idea fundamentally that in the current environment, in the current political climate, if you and I simply fish out of the same pond based purely on self-interest, the pond will be empty. That there are certain things that are part of the fabric of the very aims of life that have become, you can't get more elemental than the genes in our body. When patent litigation starts to say that a corporation owns the genes in your body, that's a recipe for danger. So that's starting to happen, I think. And in terms of firing over the bow, I mean, Chris Hedges is a phenomenal public intellect. I've learned from him. He's been very good to me because I was pretty much a nobody. I still am a nobody, but I'm saying I really was very vulnerable when the government started to stick their private contractors on me. And Hedges, not only is he a great public intellectual, but he's actually a really good man. He has always watched out for me, and I think it's his care and concern for me, just as a citizen and as a journalist and a nobody, that actually protected me publicly. Because when he wrote that piece about the NDAA case, I started to notice that I didn't have problems at the airport, things like that. So that also counts for something. And he does stress about nonviolence, not merely just in ethical and religious terms because he studied divinity, but also because fundamentally we want to convince the law enforcement, the police, to join our side. And it's very easy to tear things down. It's very hard to build those structures again. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for Chris Hedges.
Just quickly follow on from that, and also from Sean said before, one of the names that we haven't mentioned tonight is Daniel Ellsberg, who's someone who's spoken up both for Assange and for Manne, of course, the person who leaked the Pentagon Papers. And he's kind of an interesting figure to think about, because, of course, if you did that today, you would be facing hundreds of years in prison. And actually, Ellsberg was able to walk free. And I guess it does illustrate that, being an activist is not always a succession of defeats that you talk about. Occasionally we do have wins, but also that you can't necessarily do these things alone. That, Ellsberg was able to leak the Pentagon Papers and get away with it because at that stage there was a level of support that we don't have today. And I think it is an interesting comparison to think about in the current context.
Sorry, this microphone's doing weird things too. We have a few more questions. I'm just kind of looking at the time, Robert.
Yeah.
How is everybody doing?
Yeah. We'll be Prussian and finish at 8:30.
Okay, so I've got 4 more questions here. So anyone else that wants a question, get in now.
Hello. Hi, just to introduce myself, my name's Melanie Yanketi. I'm sort of, I guess, technically loosely involved in solidarity to the Assange campaign. My life's been sabotaged. My phone doesn't work. I've had all kinds of information about my family deleted from the internet, and all kind of troubles. And I know Julian Assange is in a lot of trouble. Basically, Manning, the leaks that he did, obviously, that's. I'm not saying this isn't important that that's happened, but Julian's in deep trouble. And rather than condemn him to a so-called inevitable punishment from America, which we seem to assume, isn't it better to discourage further involvement in any kind of leaks and actually calm down the situation? I mean, the so-called out-of-control media, such as the Alex movie, which kind of whitewashes and calms down the whole thing, isn't that actually helpful?
How so?
Sorry, we'll try and make the questions a bit briefer, so just one.
If the world believes that journalists are terrorists for publishing the truth, why shouldn't we calm them down? Do you understand the question? Like, do we really want to dig the hole further by discouraging behaviour which is at risk of becoming illegal if it's a controversial?
I understand.
You want to answer it?
Well, I mean, if people want to take risks, they will, and no one can discourage people from being courageous, even if they're going to. I mean, I spent a lot of my younger time looking at Soviet dissidents, and you could have told Sakharov or Solzhenitsyn that they were fools, that they were taking too big a risk, but they wouldn't have been convinced, even if you were right, and you would have been wrong, in fact. But you can't, if people want to, because their consciences are stirred, want to take risks, they will.
Do I need to use this? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, speak loud.
Sorry, I just want to raise one point and then one question. I think, I agree with Manne that, WikiLeaks did find a chink in the US armor, but it's not hit a stumbling block. It's okay, so to set up a whistleblowing organization that allows you to, it doesn't require much manpower. But when you're faced with, the Murdoch empire of 200 newspapers, thousands of journalists, and then you have Alexa on the other hand, that's not, that's not a question of the truth. That's a question of numbers, and we simply don't have the numbers to, penetrate and bypass the propaganda machine that most people are immersed in. So that you can't even see that it's a propaganda machine. So I think that's the task of the problem of the left, is that in the past we did have organizations that were substantial, that could put out alternative press that people could follow. For their problems, whether it was groups like the Black Panther Party or the Communists, whatever, which all face all the same kind of issues that WikiLeaks face now. Counter Intel Pro, the McCarthy witch hunts, all those kind of things are just as totalitarian. The only difference now is that the scale is so much more freakier. So my question is, one, that's the what was my question now? My question was, one, we need to move beyond just I think has the WikiLeaks model hit a dead end? We've already know the truth. The truth is out there. Now we need to move on to something else. I think that's pretty pat about where the next shot at the empire should take. And then two, how can we organize? The Occupy was a really good, excellent example. We need more things like Occupy, even if it's not going to look like Occupy. That's my question anyway.
Do you want to answer it? Well, I think you're raising an important point because you're diagnosing the problem. You're talking about the scale of the Murdoch press. And what is the advantage of the Murdoch press in terms of the market? It's that it's able to sort of differentiate itself from the glut. And I think, so it starts with one person. We could sit down tonight and draw up a strategy plan, and you want to do that? I'll meet with you till 4 o'clock in the morning. We could figure it all out, and then you and I are gonna do it together. I mean, I think hypotheticals are important because I think I'm not trying to negate what you're saying. I think it's really important. I think we've just begun with the WikiLeaks model. We're at the beginning of it. I mean, we have to also look at the learning curve. There are learning curves within institutions like corporations, there are learning curves within the public sphere as well. And I think we've just started on the learning curve of the WikiLeaks model. I think also that we have to also look at that learning curve and how it's a little bit different than our, let's say, our ancestors or our predecessors or parents, in the sense that in the digital realm, that learning curve is a bit inverted, because whereas before we had a culture of apprenticeship, which is part of the labor union movement. I join a trade union, you know, I'm an apprentice, then I become a journeyman, then I'm a master. It's top down. Here in the technical realm, it's completely different. I come out of school, or I'm 14 and I'm a programmer. I'm the one with the best skills. I mean, programmers probably are like hacking into my website right now, like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. It's not to say that there is an experience that comes with programming, but it's a little bit different in the sense that we become a society of technicians. So, you know, when we get out, we think that we can do whatever we want because we have the skills and the capacity, and we're the young workhorses, so to speak. So I think that all of these things are changing. All these like fundamental institutions are changing, and I think that we're really at the beginning of it. And I really believe that Chris Hedges is probably onto something when he says that it'll take one action. It'll be one small thing that will create that larger movement. What's important now is that we start to really just simply act authentically within the truth, individually. I really believe that. I mean, I am a nobody, and yet I know in the last 3 years I've been part of such a tremendous movement and had, you know, my tiny website, it might not have changed the outcome of Manning's trial, but it had an impact. And it had a bigger impact than 14 hours a day, one person. And that's because my website scaled it out. So I do think that individual actors have tremendous power. And I'm sorry, I'll stop talking in 2 seconds. I just want to say this. We talk about asymmetric threats. And I've said before, you know, that there are asymmetric opportunities too.
Good answer. And related to the last question, question for Robert, does WikiLeaks have a future as a political party in Australia and the world?
I mean, I wasn't involved in any of that. I voted for the Greens. I don't know why, you know, Julian was interested in getting a political party going. I can't see that it would have made much difference to anything. I think it was probably because he wanted to put the Australian government into a sort of embarrassing situation in case. I think the way he sees things, and I think he's a very strategic thinker, he sees the big problem is the extradition to the United States and the trial, which would crush him, but more importantly crush his movement, and he wanted to get the Australian government perhaps to defend him as a long shot, and that would be more likely to do so if he was elected a senator. But apart from that, I never thought there was a chance, unless they did, you know, these mad preferential deals with shooters and motor enthusiasts, and by accident got to the Senate. I don't think it was likely to happen. So I think the progressive part of politics, I mean, I'm sorry because a lot of people here put time into the WikiLeaks party. I think the progressive party of politics with a likely effect are the Greens, and that's where I'm putting, so far as I put energy into party politics, is there, but I hope that's not unsatisfactory. Probably is, but that's what I think.
I tend to agree. I'm asking. It's weird. Sorry, this lady asked me to ask a question to Alexa, which is what's next for Chelsea Manning, and will the appeals process be more open and fair?
I'm so grateful that you asked that question, because I didn't say this at the Sydney Opera House and I want to kick myself. Right now, actually until tomorrow, today's Saturday, right?
It's Friday.
Friday, okay, so we have one more day to get 50,000 signatures on an Amnesty International, Bradley Manning Support Network, currently private Manning Support Network, a petition. Obama's probably not going to do anything, but I'll tell you what, 25,000 signatures on this petition is going to do even less. So we need to show that there's a political capital that supports Chelsea Manning. The second thing is that the current appeals process is as follows. Manning's case will go to the Army Court of Criminal Appeals automatically to be reviewed for mistakes of fact and also mistakes of legal reasoning on the part of the military judge. However, it's currently with the commander of the Military District of Washington. Please do not rely on the American public to write letters to this commander. This commander has the power to reduce Manning's sentence and to strike down convictions. So it is imperative that the public around the globe go to the private Manning Support Network website. I'll tweet it out, actually, if any of you follow me, I'll make sure to tweet out the links right after this. Go to their website, write a letter to this Major General, ask him for clemency for Bradley Manning. Go to this petition and sign this petition so that whether or not Obama does anything, he's not given the false understanding that the public doesn't care about Chelsea Manning.
One more and then we...
Yeah, there was two more.
Then we finish.
Yeah, two more. Hi, so I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the climate in the United States, because I think it's probably, seems to me it's probably a lot worse than it seems from the outside to people who aren't in there. Because particularly in the context of Barack Obama being president, I do notice that there is a section of activists and people in movements that are more tolerant of Barack Obama doing things than if it was, say, a Republican president. Particularly, drones is an obvious one, but Whistleblowers is another, and even, potential war in places like Syria. And I wondered if you thought there was any scope to win any of these people over who've perhaps seen the experience of Barack Obama doing these bad things, or is in fact not a realistic possibility to win any of these people to a more politically radical position, or what kind of scope there is to resist that kind of, liberalism of sorts, smaller liberalism, what we call here. And perhaps then, I don't know, you can maybe talk about how the international community or activists in the international community might be able to help given that climate.
Do you want to answer that? You're asking, let me make sure I understand your question. You're asking me within the American community if there is a chance of actually having, let's say, this American community of the left actually see Obama for what he is? I mean, I think that we're just now beginning to see it with when public intellectuals like Cornel West speak up and talk about how racist Obama's drone policies are. It's interesting. I mean, I've said before, my sense of revolution or reformation in the United States always comes from the pulpit. Churches play a fundamental role of reform, moral reform. When you look at, and I think the African American community has always been the driving force of reform within the United States, moral reform. And for me, I think that Obama is worse than Bush because he pretends to be something that he's not. I think Obama is a brand. I think that Obama is a puppet, and I think he's a horrible orator to boot. He won Ad Age Brand of the Year after he won the 2008 election, and I think for good reason, because he represents something. But there's really, it's like any other brand. It's actions speak louder than words. He's a great sophist though, because the NDAA case is a perfect example. Here he appeals to, some kind of polite rhetoric about the fact that he doesn't want to sign this horrible piece of legislation and he's going to put a signing statement in it. Funny enough, the judge in our case in the Southern District of New York said that his signing statement essentially said, you will not have, be detained without a trial, meaning a military trial for a civilian. So he's very tricky. But I think that once again it comes down to how does one lobby people in a trance that want to believe. In many cases Obama, is a watershed moment in U.S. history because he's the first black president. And so much of the left also feels that if you criticize Obama, you criticize it's based in racism. So there's all of these tricks and riddles about looking at this presidency, what I believe to be accurately, which is that he's really just another executive that is a puppet of the military intelligence sector and the other entrenched interests that have already taken over the U.S. government and all of our national power.
This is the last question.
The final question. So that'll be good. Speaking of long-term campaigns, do you think the Free Chelsea Manning campaign people could learn something from the Free Nelson Mandela campaign?
Do you know, I'm going to answer that question honestly. I don't know. I will just say this: the Private Manning Support Network has done a phenomenal job raising money for Manning, because Manning has had a phenomenal defense team, and they're raising money right now for the appeals team, which will be different because they're going to have to be able to criticize how Manning's trial was conducted and have a fresh pair of eyes. So donate to them, and maybe you could actually talk to Nathan Fuller and share your views with him on that.
We better finish there. Can I just say thanks, Jeff, very much for coming along. I just want to say I think we've been, and I think we all know, we've been in the presence of a really remarkable American citizen, and I'd like to thank you very much for coming to Australia again, and if you could all thank Alexa for what she's doing. Thank you all very much for coming and for being so patient. Had a long, fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.